The committee will come to order, and I ask all visitors and members to take their seats. Today is a very, very special day in my legislative career, but not so special that I don't share with the committee that votes are going to be taking on the floor at 11:15, and we might want to consider that in terms of how long we're in the hearing room. Why this vote is so special to me is that I've always admired and respected the broad jurisdiction of this committee. But even more than that, the leadership that the committee had provided to members of the House who depended on the fact that we work hard, we study the issues and the complex questions, and they depend on us for direction. It was considerable political pain for me to witness over the years the polarization and the division that existed in this committee, and the fact that with trade in particular, not only were we excluded, but we never had an opportunity to participate in what I truly believe is the constitutional right of the House and this committee to be involved in trade. True, we delegate this responsibility to the executive branch, but we had thought that as it relates to U.S. trade policy, that they shouldn't be a Republican policy or a Democratic policy, but at least every partner that trades with us should know what our great country stands for. I cannot laud the efforts of Jim McCrary enough for his efforts in trying to make certain that whether we were talking about Peru, Panama, Korea, or Colombia, that we wanted to end up at the end of the day saying that at least as related to what we stood for in trade, that the United States trade representatives, the U.S. Treasury, the House, the Senate would know, and every country would know, what did we stand for. The question of how we treat other people's workers and how we treat the environment may not have been important to a lot of people, but so many Democrats have felt that just being excluded from the consideration of this in our foreign policy prevented them from looking at trade agreements that kept it out. And so we talked, we debated, and we agreed that it would be there. And of course, we said that we would study every bill. I cannot tell you the work that Sandy Levin has put into this to make certain that we just weren't talking words, but we were talking about a policy that every American should feel proud of. And as it relates to Peru, even though there were some differences in belief as to whether or not they should implement it before or after we vote for it, anyone reading the statements of President Garcia would know that he has welcomed the opportunity to provide the leadership to make certain that when we talk about trade, we're talking about not only people who work, but we're talking about the environment in which they work. I cannot see how any American could not be proud of that. Whether they're for the bills or not for the bills, it's what our great country stands for. And being on this committee truly means that we have that awesome responsibility to admit that if we're not in trade, we're losing. Globalization is here. It is not a union, non-union, Republican, conservative, Democratic, liberal issue. It's an issue as to what's good for the United States worker, what's good for the international community, what contributions have we made, and it also means that we're on the committee that will have to do things that sometimes is not as popular as we would want it to be. With Colombia, everyone recognizes that there is great concern about the influence of other leaders in that area, as well as the opportunity for trade for us with Colombia. With Korea, everyone knows, especially the administration, that its provision for automobiles and beef are not nearly as attractive as they are for our service industry. With Panama, there's some confusion in the administration as to whether or not we're taking that up next, or we're going to look at Colombia because they concluded that earlier. But for today, I think, all of us, Republican and Democrats, and especially members of this August committee, will have an opportunity to break the polarization and go into a bipartisan thing and ask the question, is this good for the United States of America? And is working together good for the Congress? And if it is good for our Congress and working together, then it should be good for the people that we're so proud to represent. And so I want to publicly thank Mr. McCreary, not only for dealing with the questions of trade standards, but in joining me in saying that the administration and the private sector has to concern itself with the impact of these trade agreements on those people who've lost their job, who lost their opportunity, who don't have the training, who don't have the education to pick up the pieces and to move on in their communities. And to his credit, he has joined with me in saying, and whether or not their situation exists because of trade agreements or not, it's our responsibility to take care of Americans' towns and villages economically. And so no matter where we go in the future, Jim, you have helped me to get a true beginning of dialogue, not only with members of this great committee, but certainly with an administration. And for this, I thank you, and I yield to you at this time for you to make remarks that you may want.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Likewise, can't say publicly enough, and I have said it publicly many times, how much credit you deserve for your willingness to even enter into a dialogue early on this year, this calendar year, on the subject of trade. I believe that the discussions that you and I and Sandy Levin and Wally Herger and the United States Trade Representative and Secretary Paulson had were at all times constructive, and I believe we ended up with a framework which is positive, which I believe represents the best thinking of Americans on how we proceed with expanding trade around the globe. And it certainly, I believe, represents, that framework represents a path forward for a bipartisan consensus, or at least a bipartisan majority that will allow us to continue to be in the forefront of expanding trade around the world. So, Mr. Chairman, I think today's non-markup, as we call it, of the first of 4 free trade agreements that have been negotiated and are on the table represents an extremely important date for the efforts of this committee that has jurisdiction over this very important subject. And you and Mr. Levin's efforts are to be commended by me, Republicans, the President, and all Americans, in my view. So thank you very much for being a partner in this effort. I'm very excited. I know you can't tell it by my demeanor, but trust me, I'm very excited about what we're doing today. And I do hope, Mr. Chairman, that your leadership will continue in bringing before this committee eventually all 4 of the free trade agreements that are queued up. The Latin American agreements, not just Peru, but Colombia and Panama, I believe are extremely important, not only for the economic benefits for both countries in each bilateral trade agreement, but also for geopolitical reasons in the region of South America, Latin America, which I think is extremely important to the future of our country. So I hope that you will continue to work with me and the United States Trade Representative and the President to bring those agreements before this committee for consideration in due time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to personally thank Mr. Herger, who unfortunately is not well, for his cooperative spirit in making certain that we all came out reading from the same page, and also to shatter any myths that there has been a difference of opinion in approaching this with the chairman of the subcommittee on trade, Sandy Levin. Sometimes we express ourselves, as the ranking member said, in different ways, but I could not and we could not have been there without the expertise, input, and direction of the gentleman that I yield to, Mr. Levin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to Jim McCreary. Today's markup is anything but a mock. In terms of shaping a new trade policy, it is very real. For us on this side, and I would hope beyond, there is a basic issue. Should trade policy be written so that trade is shaped to expand its benefits broadly, more broadly than in the past? If so, workers must be a vital part of the trade equation. That means that basic rights of workers, as stated in the 1998 ILO Declaration, must be written into the body of the FTA, subject to the same dispute settlement process and remedies as all other provisions in the FTA. For the first time, the U.S.-Peru agreement does so. If so, basic environmental provisions with enforceability must be written into the FTA, so that trade does not depend on who can most degrade their environment. For the first time, this FTA requires that the parties must enforce multilateral environmental agreements, and specific to Peru, major steps to curb illegal logging. And if so, millions in need of vital medicines must have access to them. For the first time, this FTA contains provisions to assure that the rules on intellectual property help bring this about. The U.S.-Peru FTA was renegotiated to incorporate these key changes as first steps toward a new trade policy. Addressing these basic changes, which were central to the minority, now the majority's opposition to CAFTA, these key provisions were incorporated in the May 10th agreement between Congress and the administration. As a result, the U.S.-Peru FTA is neither NAFTA nor CAFTA. As stated by us on May 10th, while these new provisions were vital to each FTA, each one must be fully considered on its own. The Peru FTA is not a one-size-fits-all template for FTAs. And I emphasize this: each FTA presents its own unique issues that must be addressed, whether it is Panama, Colombia, or South Korea. And to ensure that the vital changes in the provisions of the Peru FTA were reflected in action to implement them, we engaged Peru in their effort to undertake changes in their legal structures to implement the unprecedented inclusion of the 5 basic worker rights standards as stated in the ILO Declaration. In implementing those obligations of his country, the Peruvian President Garcia has heralded the U.S.-Peru FTA as, in his words, a New Deal for international trade to bring about the broader sharing of the benefits of expanded trade for workers. I strongly urge support for the U.S.-Peru FTA. It is an important step toward a new trade policy, one that takes on the essential need to expand the sharing of benefits of expanded trade and addressing its downsides. Doing so is vital to making globalization work.
And now the committee will informally mark up the United States-Peru Trade Promotion Agreement Implementation Act. Without objection, the draft implementation proposal is considered read and open for amendment at any point. The chair would recognize that we have Tim Reef from our trade staff. Let me say that without Tim Reef and VG and Angela Elliott keeping this thing together, working day and literally at night, and also Everett Eisenstadt who stayed with us to make certain that what we were doing followed the policies of our trade representative. Not only your commitment here in Washington, but in our travels to Peru and meeting with the president. In other words, so many different people made it possible to put this together, and I just want to publicly thank them for it. And so we'll have Tim Reef and Warren Marunyama, the General Counsel to the United States Trade Representative's Office, and of course, Mr. Eisenstadt, the Assistant USTR for the Americas, with us today. And I asked Mr. Reef to briefly give us an overview of the proposal, and then we will entertain questions from the members of this committee. And again, I publicly want to thank all of you for the part that you played, which I think that Jim McCrary and Sandy truly believe that this is an historic moment for the committee, for the Congress, and for our country. Thank you. Mr. Reef, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McCrary. The proposal has 6 titles. Very briefly, the first title deals with the approval provisions and the general provisions, such as approval and entry into force, relationship between the United States law and the agreement, consultation and layover provisions for the committee, administration of dispute settlement proceedings, and the effective date. Title II, sir, contains the customs provisions related to tariff modifications, rules of origin, the provisions to implement the agricultural safeguard, and enforcement of provisions relating to trade in textile and apparel products. Title III of the proposal contains the provisions relating to relief from imports. Subtitle A relates to the relief from imports under the bilateral safeguard mechanism. Subtitle B relates to relief from imports in the textile and apparel safeguard mechanism. And Subtitle C deals with changes to the general United States safeguard mechanism at Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974. Title IV of the bill contains a procurement provision. Title V of the bill contains provisions that have been discussed this morning relating to the enforcement of the logging provisions of the agreement, including the ability of the executive branch to conduct audits and verifications, and the confidential treatment of documents, as well as the public disclosure of information supporting the implementation of the logging annex to the agreement. And Title VI of the bill contains the offsets to the cost of the bill, a customs user fee provision and a corporate estimated taxes provision.
Any questions concerning the presentation by given Mr. Reef? Are there any amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, may I have one question for Mr. Reef?
Mr. Doggett.
Mr. Reef, if I understand the changes that were made to the preamble concerning investor rights, the objective and the sole objective of those changes is to assure that foreign investors get no greater rights than American citizens have under the investment protection provisions.
That's correct, Mr. Doggett. And the summary of the agreement that's been circulated by the administration actually states that very clearly. It says that the provision you allude to in the preamble, it says this statement would clarify that, as stated in the Bipartisan Trade Promotion Authority Act of 2002, foreign investors in the United States are not to be accorded greater substantive rights with respect to investment protections than United States investors in the United States.
And in that way, it represents a significant change from prior trade agreements that this committee has considered.
Yes, sir, we believe so.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions or amendments to the proposal? If not, the chair will put the question on the draft implementation proposal. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The proposal is agreed to, and the committee stands adjourned.